Margaret Santos had always been the kind of woman who blended into crowds. At 52, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing the same style of modest dresses she had worn for 20 years, she looked like any other widow in the small desert town of Copper Ridge, Arizona. The locals knew her as the quiet lady who ran the general store on Main Street, always polite but never one for long conversations. What they didn't know was that Margaret's late husband, Carlos, had been half Apache, and during their 30 years of marriage, he had shared more than just his love with her. He had shared the ancient fighting techniques passed down through generations of his people, skills that few white women had ever been taught, let alone mastered. Carlos had been a patient teacher, starting their lessons when Margaret was just 22 and newly married. At first, it seemed like playful wrestling in their backyard, but as the years passed, the training became more serious. Carlos taught her how to move like water, how to read an opponent's intentions in their eyes, and most importantly, how to use any object as a weapon. He showed her the deadly precision of Apache knife work, the art of throwing blades with accuracy that could split a playing card at 20 feet. The training sessions always took place behind their small adobe house, away from prying eyes. Carlos would set up targets made from old fence posts and teach Margaret to throw knives, kitchen utensils, even rocks with lethal precision. He taught her that size and strength meant nothing if you knew where to strike, and how to use your opponent's momentum against them. Margaret had loved those evening sessions, not just because they brought her closer to Carlos, but because she discovered a natural talent for the ancient arts. Her small hands were quick and steady, her movements fluid and graceful. Carlos often told her she moved like his grandmother, who had been legendary among their people for her fighting skills. After Carlos died 5 years ago from a heart attack, Margaret had continued practicing in secret. Every morning before dawn, she would slip into her backyard and go through the routines Carlos had taught her. She kept her throwing knives sharp and hidden throughout the house, disguised as kitchen utensils or tucked behind picture frames. To anyone who visited, they looked like ordinary household items. The people of Copper Ridge saw only what Margaret allowed them to see. She was the widow who never remarried, who kept to herself, who closed her store at exactly 5 o'clock every day and walked the 3 blocks home to her empty house. She attended church on Sundays, bought groceries on Wednesdays, and paid her bills on time. She was invisible in the way that middle-aged women often become in small towns. Her store reflected her personality, or at least the personality she showed the world. The shelves were neat and organized, prices clearly marked, and Margaret always had exact change ready. She sold the usual items that desert folk needed: canned goods, basic tools, rope, boots, and work clothes. Travelers passing through often stopped for directions or supplies, and Margaret was always helpful, though she rarely volunteered information about herself. The store had been Carlos's dream. He had worked construction jobs throughout Arizona and New Mexico, saving every penny until they could afford to buy the small building on Main Street. Margaret had helped him convert it from an old saloon into a proper general store, and they had run it together until his death. Now she managed it alone, finding comfort in the familiar routine of inventory and customers. Margaret's daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. She unlocked the store at 8 in the morning, swept the front porch, and arranged the display of tools and household goods that hung from hooks outside the front door. She ate lunch alone in the back room, usually a simple sandwich and coffee. In the afternoons, she would help customers, restock shelves, and update her handwritten ledger books. But there were signs that Margaret was different from other widows in town, if anyone had bothered to look closely. Her movements were too fluid, too controlled. When she reached for items on high shelves, she moved with a dancer's grace. Her hands, though lined with age, were strong and calloused in unusual places. And her eyes, her dark eyes, missed nothing. She noticed every person who entered her store, cataloged their mood, their intentions, their potential threat level. The town of Copper Ridge sat at the intersection of 2 desert highways, making it a natural stopping point for travelers. Most were honest folks just passing through, but occasionally, less savory characters would appear. Margaret had learned to read people quickly during her years behind the counter. She could spot trouble before it announced itself. Local law enforcement consisted of Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man in his 60s who had been keeping the peace in Copper Ridge for over 20 years. His deputy, Mike Torres, was younger and eager but inexperienced. They handled the usual small-town problems: drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional theft. The town had been relatively quiet for years, which was exactly how most residents liked it. Margaret's house sat on a quiet side street lined with similar adobe homes. Her neighbors were mostly elderly couples and other widows. Mrs. Chen lived to the left, and the Rodriguez family lived to the right with their 3 young children. Everyone waved when they saw each other, but they weren't particularly close friends. Margaret preferred it that way. The desert surrounding Copper Ridge stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by mesas, arroyos, and the occasional ranch. It was beautiful in its starkness, but it was also unforgiving. People who lived there learned to be self-sufficient and tough. Margaret had been both of those things long before she moved to the desert, but the harsh landscape had reinforced those qualities. As autumn settled over the desert, bringing cooler nights and the promise of winter, Margaret continued her quiet routine. She had no idea that her peaceful existence was about to be shattered by 3 men who thought they had found an easy target. They were about to learn that appearances could be deadly deceiving, and that the quiet widow who ran the general store was far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The 3 men rolled into Copper Ridge on a Tuesday morning in a battered pickup truck that had seen better days. The vehicle's paint was faded and scratched, and black smoke puffed from its exhaust pipe as it rumbled down Main Street. Anyone who bothered to look would have noticed the out-of-state license plates and the way the truck sat low on its springs, suggesting it carried more weight than was visible. Jake Morrison sat behind the wheel, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as he surveyed the small town. At 45, he was the leader of their small group, a man who had spent the last 20 years moving from place to place, always looking for easy opportunities. His gray beard was unkempt, and his clothes carried the smell of cigarettes and cheap motels. Jake had done time in 3 different states, mostly for theft and assault, and he had learned to spot vulnerable targets. Sitting beside him was Tommy Garrett, a wiry man of 38 whose nervous energy filled the truck cab. Tommy's hands were constantly moving, drumming on his knees or fidgeting with his cigarette lighter. He had a thin face marked by old acne scars, and his pale eyes darted continuously from building to building as they drove through town. Tommy specialized in breaking into places, and he was already mentally cataloging which businesses looked promising. In the back seat, Danny Morrison, Jake's younger brother, stretched his large frame as much as the cramped space allowed. At 6'4" and weighing nearly 250 pounds, Danny was their muscle. He wasn't particularly bright, but he was useful when intimidation was needed. At 31, Danny had already spent 5 years in prison for armed robbery, and he carried himself with the swagger of a man who enjoyed causing fear in others. The 3 had been traveling together for 6 months, working their way across the Southwest and leaving a trail of small crimes behind them. They specialized in targeting isolated businesses and vulnerable individuals, preferring situations where they were unlikely to encounter serious resistance. Small towns like Copper Ridge were perfect for their purposes: limited law enforcement, predictable routines, and people who weren't expecting trouble. They had spotted Copper Ridge on their map 2 days earlier while hiding out in a truck stop 50 miles away. The town was small enough to be manageable, but large enough to have businesses worth robbing. Better yet, it was far enough from major cities that local law enforcement would be minimal and response times would be slow. Jake parked the truck in front of the diner, and the 3 men climbed out, stretching their legs and looking around with the casual interest of tourists. But their eyes were already working, noting the locations of the bank, the general store, the gas station, and other potential targets. They were also looking for escape routes and observing the patterns of local traffic. The diner was busy with the breakfast crowd, mostly local ranchers and workers grabbing coffee and eggs before starting their day. Jake, Tommy, and Danny took a corner booth where they could watch the street while they ate. The waitress, a friendly woman named Betty, who had worked at the diner for 15 years, brought them coffee and menus without suspecting anything unusual about her new customers. While they ate, the 3 men listened to conversations at nearby tables, picking up information about the town and its residents. They learned about Sheriff Bradley's schedule, the fact that the bank only had 2 employees, and various other details that might prove useful. They were particularly interested when they overheard 2 ranchers discussing Margaret Santos and her general store. "That poor woman works too hard," one rancher was saying to another. "Been running that store all by herself since Carlos died." Never takes a day off, never asks for help. Stubborn as a mule, just like her husband was. She's got to have some money saved up, the other replied. That store does good business, and she's been living alone for 5 years now. Probably keeps cash in that old safe Carlos installed in the back room. The conversation continued with the ranchers mentioning that Margaret lived alone, had no family nearby, and generally kept to herself. To Jake, Tommy, and Danny, she sounded like an ideal target, isolated, predictable, and likely to have money on the premises. After breakfast, they drove slowly through town, making mental notes of everything they saw. The general store was centrally located but set back slightly from the main street. Margaret's house was on a quiet residential street with good cover from mature trees and minimal foot traffic. The sheriff's office was at the opposite end of town, and they noticed that the patrol car was often absent, suggesting that the sheriff spent time making rounds or handling calls outside of town. They rented a room at the Desert Inn, a small motel on the outskirts of town that catered to travelers and seasonal workers. The elderly proprietor, Mr. Washington, was happy to have customers and didn't ask many questions. He accepted cash payment for a week's stay and gave them a room at the back of the complex, away from the highway noise. Over the next few days, the three men established a routine that allowed them to observe the town without drawing attention. They ate breakfast at the diner, drove around looking at ranches as if they were prospective buyers, and spent their evenings drinking beer at the town's only bar, the Copper Ridge Saloon. To anyone who asked, they were just passing through, looking for work or possibly buying property. During this time, they paid special attention to Margaret and her general store. They noticed that she arrived every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, walking the 3 blocks from her house with a purposeful stride. She unlocked the store, swept the porch, and arranged her outdoor displays with the precision of someone who had done the same tasks thousands of times. They observed that she ate lunch alone in the back room every day around noon, that she had steady but not overwhelming customer traffic, and that she closed the store promptly at 5 o'clock. They saw her walk home alone each evening, noting that she took the same route and maintained the same pace. To them, she appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a quiet, middle-aged widow going about her predictable daily routine. What they failed to notice were the subtle signs that might have warned more observant criminals. They didn't see the way Margaret's eyes tracked every person who entered her store, or the fluid grace with which she moved despite her age. They missed the fact that she always positioned herself with clear sightlines to all entrances, and they didn't notice that her hands were unusually strong and scarred for someone who supposedly just ran a store. Jake began formulating a plan. The store would be their primary target, with Margaret's house as a secondary objective if the first proved insufficient. They would wait until evening when the store was closed and the street was quiet. Margaret would be alone and unlikely to resist 3 large men, especially if they surprised her. They could force her to open the safe, take whatever cash and valuables they found, and be out of town before anyone knew what had happened. Tommy was excited by the prospect and spent his time figuring out the best way to get into the store after hours. Danny was simply looking forward to the action, hoping there might be some resistance so he could demonstrate his intimidation skills. None of them considered the possibility that their quiet, middle-aged target might be capable of fighting back. As they finalized their plans over beers at the saloon, they congratulated themselves on finding such a perfect setup. Copper Ridge seemed like the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, and Margaret Santos seemed like exactly the kind of victim they specialized in, alone, vulnerable, and unprepared for violence. They had no idea they were about to make the biggest mistake of their criminal careers. By Thursday afternoon, Jake Morrison had his plan worked out down to the smallest detail. He spread a hand-drawn map of the town across the motel room's small table, while Tommy and Danny gathered around to listen. The map showed the general store, Margaret's house, the sheriff's office, and all the major streets and escape routes they had identified. "Here's how we do this," Jake said, pointing to the store with a stubby finger. "Tomorrow night we wait until she closes up and starts walking home. Tommy, you get inside the store while Danny and I follow her to the house. We grab her before she gets inside, then we all go back to the store together." Tommy nodded eagerly, his pale eyes bright with anticipation. He had already figured out how to get into the building through a rear window that didn't look like it had been opened in years. The lock was old and would be easy to bypass with the tools he carried in his kit. Why don't we just take her at the store when she's closing up? Danny asked, cracking his knuckles. Seems easier than chasing her around town. Jake shook his head. Too visible. Main Street's got streetlights and people might still be around. Better to grab her between the store and her house, then take her back where we can work private-like. Plus, if we control her from the start, she'll be more cooperative about opening that safe. The safe was their primary target. During their surveillance, they had confirmed that Margaret's store was one of the few businesses in town that dealt primarily in cash. Ranchers and locals often paid for supplies with bills rather than checks or cards, and Margaret had been running the business long enough to have accumulated significant savings. Tommy had managed to peek through the store's back window during lunch on Wednesday and had spotted the old safe in the rear office. It was a vintage model, probably installed when the building was first converted from a saloon. Such safes were tough but not impossible to crack if you knew what you were doing, and Tommy had learned a few things about locks during his years of breaking into places. What if she doesn't cooperate? Danny asked, flexing his massive hands. What if she tries to run or fight? Jake laughed, a sound without humor. She's 50-something years old and weighs maybe 120 soaking wet. You really think she's going to give 3 grown men any trouble? Besides, women like that scare easy. Show her we mean business and she'll do whatever we want. They had observed Margaret for 4 days now, and everything they had seen reinforced their impression of her as a perfect victim. She was small, quiet, and lived alone. She followed the same routine every day, which meant they could predict exactly where she would be and when. Most importantly, she appeared to be completely unaware that she was being watched. The 3 men had been careful not to interact directly with Margaret, but they had spoken with other townspeople who confirmed their assessment. The waitress at the diner had mentioned that Margaret was sweet but shy and wouldn't hurt a fly. The bartender at the saloon had described her as keeps to herself and probably lonely since Carlos died. Even the sheriff, during a casual conversation at the gas station, had referred to Margaret as someone who never gives anybody any trouble and minds her own business. To Jake and his companions, these descriptions painted a picture of exactly the kind of person they preferred to target, someone who would be too frightened to resist and too isolated to get help. Quickly, their plan was straightforward and had worked successfully in similar towns across 3 states. They would surprise their target, use intimidation to control the situation, take whatever money and valuables they could find, and be gone before local law enforcement could respond effectively. They had refined their technique over months of practice, and they were confident in their ability to handle any complications. Friday evening arrived with a typical desert sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and red before fading to purple darkness. Jake, Tommy, and Danny spent the day making final preparations, checking their equipment and reviewing their plan one more time. They ate an early dinner at the diner, paid their motel bill through the weekend to avoid suspicion, and positioned their truck where it could be reached quickly if they needed to make a hasty exit. At 6:30, they took their positions. Tommy slipped around to the rear of the general store, carrying a small bag of tools and lock-picking equipment. Jake and Danny positioned themselves along Margaret's usual route home, hiding in the shadows between streetlights where they could intercept her without being seen. The evening was quiet, with most of the town's residents already home for dinner. A few pickup trucks moved slowly along Main Street, and the saloon showed signs of life, but overall, Copper Ridge was settling into its typical peaceful evening routine. Perfect conditions for what they had planned. At exactly 5 o'clock, they watched Margaret turn off the lights in her store, lock the front door, and begin her familiar walk home. She moved at her usual steady pace, carrying a small purse and wearing a plain brown dress that made her nearly invisible in the gathering darkness. Everything was proceeding exactly as they had observed and planned. What none of them noticed was that Margaret had been aware of their surveillance from the very first day. Carlos had taught her more than just fighting techniques during their 30 years together. He had also taught her the Apache art of awareness, how to sense when you were being watched, how to read the intentions of strangers, and how to recognize potential threats before they became actual danger. These skills had kept his people alive in hostile territory for generations, and he had passed them on to his wife with the same care he had used to teach her knife work. Margaret had spotted the 3 strangers within hours of their arrival in Copper Ridge, Their truck was unfamiliar, their license plates were from out of state, and their behavior was just slightly wrong for genuine tourists or job seekers. They asked the right questions and said the right things, but their eyes gave them away. They were studying the town too carefully, paying too much attention to details that honest visitors would ignore. She had watched them watching her, had noted their interest in her store and her routines, and had seen the way they positioned themselves to observe without being observed. Everything about them screamed predators, and Margaret had been preparing for them accordingly. During the past 3 days, while maintaining her normal routine, Margaret had been making subtle preparations. She had sharpened every blade in her hidden collection and positioned weapons throughout both her store and her house. She had varied her route home by small amounts, testing different approaches and timing. Most importantly, she had prepared herself mentally for what was coming. Carlos had always told her that the most dangerous moment in any fight was the transition from peace to violence. The person who made that transition fastest and most completely would usually win, regardless of size or strength. Margaret had been making that mental transition gradually over the past 4 days, shifting from the quiet storekeeper everyone knew into the warrior her husband had trained her to become. As she walked home on Friday evening, Margaret was no longer the helpless victim the 3 men thought they were hunting. She was a predator herself, and she was ready. Margaret walked slowly down Pine Street, her footsteps echoing softly in the desert evening air. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the same quiet widow who had made this journey home from work hundreds of times before. Her purse hung from her shoulder, her head was slightly bowed as if she were tired from a long day, and her pace was unhurried and predictable. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, every one of Margaret's senses was heightened. She could hear Jake Morrison's heavy breathing from his hiding spot behind the Rodriguez family's pickup truck, even though he thought he was concealed in shadow. She was aware of Danny Morrison's massive form crouched behind Mrs. Chen's garden wall, despite his efforts to remain invisible, and she knew exactly where Tommy Garrett was at that moment, probably already inside her store, working on the old safe that had never contained anything more valuable than insurance papers and her collection of Carlos's letters. The Apache training Carlos had given her went far beyond physical fighting techniques. He had taught her to use all her senses, to read the landscape around her for signs of danger, and to move through hostile territory with the awareness of a hunted animal. These skills had been passed down through generations of his people, refined by centuries of survival in harsh and dangerous conditions. As she approached the corner where Pine Street intersected with Maple Avenue, Margaret made a subtle adjustment to her route. Instead of turning directly toward her house as she normally would, she angled slightly toward the alley that ran behind the hardware store. It was a minor change that would appear natural to casual observers, but it positioned her exactly where she wanted to be when the attack came. Jake Morrison saw the slight deviation in her path and felt a moment of confusion. According to their surveillance, she should have turned the other direction. But he quickly dismissed the concern, assuming she was simply tired or distracted. He signaled to Danny with a subtle hand gesture, and both men began moving to intercept her at the predetermined point. Margaret heard their movement before she saw them. Jake's boots made a distinct scraping sound on the concrete sidewalk, and Danny's heavy breathing became more pronounced as he started to move. She continued walking at the same pace, but her right hand slipped casually into her purse, fingers closing around the handle of a 4-inch throwing knife that she had positioned there earlier in the day. "Evening, ma'am," Jake said as he stepped out of the shadows, trying to sound friendly and non-threatening. "I wonder if you could help us with something." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression showing mild surprise but no fear. "Of course," she said in the same quiet voice she used with customers in her store. "What can I do for you?" Danny emerged from his hiding place behind the garden wall, his bulk blocking any retreat back toward Main Street. The 2 men had positioned themselves exactly as they had planned, cutting off her escape routes and establishing control of the situation. Everything was proceeding according to their script. "We're looking for someone who knows the area real well," Jake continued, stepping closer to reduce the distance between them. "Someone who might know where a person could find some quick cash, if you know what I mean." Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "I'm not sure I understand," she said. But her dark eyes were reading every detail of the 2 men's positions, noting the way Jake favored his left leg slightly. The way Danny held his shoulders when he was preparing to grab someone, and the fact that neither of them was watching her hands. "I think you understand just fine," Jake said, dropping the pretense of politeness. "We know you run that little store, we know you live alone, and we know you keep cash in that old safe. This can go easy or it can go hard, but either way, you're going to help us get what we came for." Danny grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Jake here's being nice about it, lady. Me, I think we should just take what we want and not worry about asking politely." Margaret nodded slowly, as if accepting the reality of her situation. "I see," she said. "Well, I suppose I don't have much choice, do I?" "Now you're being smart," Jake said, reaching toward her arm to guide her back toward the store. "Let's just walk nice and quiet back to your shop, and nobody gets hurt." It was at that moment that Margaret Santos stopped being a quiet widow and became the warrior Carlos had trained her to be. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. One instant she was a frightened, middle-aged woman, and the next she was something entirely different. Her posture shifted, her breathing changed, and her eyes became as cold and focused as a hunting cat's. Jake reached for her arm and found his hand meeting empty air. Margaret had flowed backward like water, the movement so smooth and natural that it seemed impossible someone her age could move with such grace. Before he could adjust to her new position, something sharp and burning sliced across his reaching hand, opening a gash from his wrist to his knuckles. What the hell? Jake stared at his bleeding hand in shock, not understanding how she had moved so quickly or where the blade had come from. The knife in Margaret's right hand seemed to have materialized from nowhere, and it was already moving again. Danny, reacting with the reflexes of a man accustomed to violence, lunged forward to grab her. Margaret spun away from his grasping hands and planted the knife in his left thigh, driving the blade deep into the muscle before withdrawing it in one fluid motion. Danny roared in pain and surprise, stumbling backward as blood began soaking through his jeans. "She's got a knife," Jake shouted, pulling out a pistol he had kept hidden under his jacket. But Margaret was no longer where he expected her to be. She had moved again, positioning herself behind a parked car where the streetlight cast deep shadows. For 30 years, Carlos had drilled into her the importance of using terrain to her advantage. "Never fight fair," he had told her. "Use every advantage you can find. Darkness, obstacles, surprise, and your opponent's expectations. Make them fight your fight, not theirs. You want my money?" Margaret called out from the shadows, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air, but seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come and take it." Jake and Danny looked at each other with growing alarm. This was not going according to plan. The quiet, frightened widow they had been watching for 4 days had vanished, replaced by someone who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Danny's leg was bleeding freely, and Jake's hand burned with pain every time he tried to grip his pistol properly. "Tommy," Jake shouted toward the general store. "Tommy, get out here. We got problems." But Tommy Garrett was having problems of his own. The old safe he had been working on had proved more difficult than expected, and he was starting to worry that the job was taking too long. When he heard Jake's shout, he abandoned his work and ran toward the front of the store, tools still in hand. Margaret heard Tommy coming before the other 2 men did. She had been counting on all 3 of them being together when the real fighting started. Carlos had always taught her that when facing multiple opponents, you had to control the pace and location of the encounter. "Let them come to you," he had said. "Make them fight on ground you choose." As Tommy burst out of the general store and began running toward his companions, Margaret smiled for the first time all week. Now she had them exactly where she wanted them. Tommy Garrett ran toward the sounds of shouting and confusion, his lock-picking tools still clutched in one hand and a small crowbar in the other. He had expected to find Jake and Danny in complete control of the situation, with their target subdued and ready to cooperate. Instead, he found Danny limping and bleeding while Jake waved his pistol frantically at Shadows. "Where is she?" Tommy demanded, his nervous energy now transformed into genuine alarm. The plan had been simple and foolproof. 3 armed men against 1 middle-aged woman should have been over in minutes. "I don't know," Jake snarled, trying to peer into the darkness between parked cars. She moved like a damn ghost, cut Danny's leg open. And now she's hiding somewhere talking crazy talk about taking her money. Danny was leaning against a fence post, pressing his hand against the wound in his thigh. The bleeding was steady but not life-threatening, though the pain was considerable. "She ain't normal, Jake. Nobody moves like that." It was like fighting smoke. Margaret listened to their confusion from her position behind the Rodriguez family's old truck. She had positioned herself where she could see all three men, while remaining largely invisible herself. The streetlight created a pool of illumination that worked to her advantage, forcing them to stand in the light while she remained in darkness. Carlos had spent years teaching her how to use psychological warfare along with physical techniques. Fear was a weapon, he had told her, often more effective than knives or guns. Make your enemies afraid, make them doubt themselves, and half the battle was already won. You boys seem worried, Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly through the desert air, but still seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I thought you wanted my money. I'm right here waiting for you to come take it. Jake spun toward the sound of her voice, raising his pistol. Show yourself, old woman. Stop playing games. Games? Margaret's laugh was soft, but carried a cold edge that made all three men shiver involuntarily. You think this is a game? You come to my town, watch my store, plan to rob me and probably hurt me, and you think I'm playing games? She moved while she spoke, flowing from one shadow to another with the fluid grace Carlos had drilled into her over decades of practice. The Apache way was never to remain stationary, never to give your enemies a fixed target. Keep moving, stay unpredictable, and strike when they least expected it. Tommy raised his crowbar and started moving toward where he thought her voice had come from. There's three of us and one of her, he said to Jake. We just gotta flush her out into the open. Be my guest, Margaret said from behind him. Tommy spun around just in time to see a small figure emerge from the shadows like a wraith. Margaret's throwing knife caught him in the shoulder before he could react, the blade sinking deep into muscle and causing him to drop the crowbar with a cry of pain. Before he could recover, she had retrieved the knife and faded back into darkness. Now all three men were wounded and thoroughly demoralized. What should have been a simple robbery had turned into a nightmare, where their intended victim seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, striking with deadly precision and disappearing before they could retaliate. Jake was beginning to panic. In 20 years of preying on vulnerable targets, he had never encountered anything like this. The quiet widow they had been watching was gone, replaced by something that fought with skills he had never seen outside of movies. She moved with the confidence of someone who had been trained for war, not someone who ran a country store. We got to get out of here, Danny said through gritted teeth. This ain't worth it. Let's just go back to the truck and get out of town. But Margaret had no intention of letting them leave. These men had come to her town planning to hurt her, possibly kill her and steal from her. More importantly, if she let them go, they would just find other victims in other towns. Carlos had taught her that when you were forced to fight, you fought to win completely. Leaving so soon? She asked from a new position. But we were just getting acquainted. Jake fired his pistol in the direction of her voice, the shot echoing loudly in the quiet evening air. The bullet sparked off concrete somewhere in the darkness, but there was no indication that it had found its target. Missed, Margaret observed calmly. My turn. The throwing knife appeared out of the darkness like a silver streak, striking Jake's gun hand and causing him to drop the weapon with a howl of pain. The pistol clattered across the pavement and came to rest under a parked car well out of reach. How? Jake stared at his bleeding hand in disbelief. How did you do that? Practice, Margaret said, stepping into the edge of the streetlight where they could see her clearly for the first time since the attack began. All three men stared in shock. The woman standing before them bore little resemblance to the quiet widow they had been observing. Her posture was straight and alert, her movements controlled and precise. Her dark eyes held no fear, only the cold calculation of a predator evaluating wounded prey. She held another throwing knife in her right hand, and they could see that she was perfectly comfortable with the weapon. 30 years, she said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. 30 years my husband taught me the old ways. Apache ways. How to hunt, how to track, how to fight, and how to kill when killing was necessary. Tommy was holding his wounded shoulder, staring at her with something approaching awe. You're not just some store owner. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I am exactly what I appear to be, a widow who runs a general store and minds her own business. The problem is that you three didn't mind your own business. She began walking toward them, her steps measured and deliberate. Each movement was fluid and controlled, like a dancer or a martial artist. The knife in her hand caught the streetlight and reflected it back in cold flashes. Carlos always told me that there are two kinds of people in this world, she continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Those who leave others alone and those who don't. You three are the kind who don't." Jake tried to back away but stumbled over his own feet, his wounded hand making it difficult to maintain his balance. "Look, lady, maybe we can work something out." "We didn't mean any real harm, didn't you?" Margaret asked, tilting her head slightly. "You were going to rob me, probably hurt me to make me cooperate, maybe kill me afterwards so I couldn't identify you. That sounds like real harm to me." Danny pushed himself away from the fence post, trying to put more distance between himself and the small woman, who had somehow become the most dangerous person he had ever encountered. "We wouldn't have killed nobody. We just needed some quick cash." "And you thought a woman living alone would be easy prey," Margaret said. "You thought wrong." The sound of a siren began to echo faintly in the distance. Someone had heard Jake's gunshot and called the sheriff. Margaret glanced toward the sound but didn't seem concerned. If anything, she looked slightly disappointed that the evening's entertainment was about to be interrupted. "Sounds like Sheriff Bradley is on his way," she observed. "I suppose we should wrap this up." Jake felt a moment of relief. Once the law arrived, this nightmare would be over. Even if they were arrested, at least they would be safe from the deadly woman who had turned their simple robbery into a horror show. But Margaret wasn't finished with them yet. "Carlos taught me that, when you defeat an enemy, you have to make sure they understand why they were defeated," she said. "Otherwise, they'll just go hurt someone else." She moved toward Tommy first, the knife spinning casually in her fingers. Tommy tried to run, but his wounded shoulder and his terror made him clumsy. Margaret caught up with him in 3 quick steps and pressed the point of the blade against his throat. "Feel that?" she asked quietly. "That's death, Tommy Garrett. That's how close you came to dying tonight. Remember that feeling the next time you think about hurting someone." She released him and turned toward Danny, who was too wounded and too frightened to even attempt escape. The knife point touched his chest right over his heart. "You're big and strong, Danny Morrison," she said. "You've probably scared a lot of people over the years. But size doesn't matter when someone knows what they're doing. Remember that." Finally, she approached Jake, who was now sitting on the ground, cradling his injured hand and staring at her with undisguised terror. Margaret knelt beside him and placed the knife against his carotid artery. "You're the leader," she said softly. "The one who makes the plans and chooses the victims. Do you know how easy it would be for me to open this artery? How quickly you would bleed out right here on Pine Street?" Jake's eyes were wide with fear and he couldn't seem to form words. The blade was razor-sharp and held with the steady hand of someone who had thrown thousands of knives over 3 decades of practice. "I could kill all 3 of you right now and claim self-defense," Margaret continued. 3 armed men attacking a woman walking home from work. Any jury in Arizona would call it justified. The sirens were getting closer now and they could see the flashing lights of Sheriff Bradley's patrol car turning onto Pine Street. Margaret stood up and stepped back, the knife disappearing into her dress so quickly it seemed like magic. "But I won't kill you," she said. "Not tonight. Instead, I'm going to let you live with the knowledge that you were beaten by a 52-year-old widow who runs a general store. I want you to remember that every time you think about targeting someone you think is helpless." Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up to the scene, its headlights illuminating the 3 wounded men and the small woman standing calmly in the middle of the street. The sheriff stepped out of his vehicle with his hand on his service weapon, trying to assess what had happened. "Evening, Tom," Margaret said in her normal quiet voice. "These 3 gentlemen were just leaving town. They had a little accident while they were walking around, but I think they'll be fine once they get some medical attention." The sheriff looked at the 3 bleeding men, then at Margaret, then back at the men. He had been lawman long enough to recognize the aftermath of a fight, and he could tell from the positions and injuries who had won. "Margaret," he said carefully, "are you all right?" "I'm fine, Tom, just fine. Though I think you might want to check my store. I believe one of these gentlemen may have been inside without permission." As Sheriff Bradley began sorting out the details and calling for an ambulance, Margaret walked quietly back to her house. She had laundry to do and preparations to make for tomorrow's business day. The excitement was over and she was ready to return to her peaceful routine. Behind her, 3 would-be criminals sat bleeding and defeated, forever changed by their encounter with the quiet widow who had learned to fight from the Apache. 3 months later, Copper Ridge had returned to its normal quiet routine, but the events of that October evening had become the stuff of local legend. The story of Margaret Santos and the 3 would-be robbers had spread throughout the desert Southwest, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some versions had her fighting off 10 men single-handed. Others claimed she had thrown knives with such precision that she could split bullets in mid-air. Margaret herself never spoke about what had happened that night. When people asked her about it, she would simply say that the men had slipped and hurt themselves while walking around in the dark. She maintained her quiet demeanor, her regular schedule, and her preference for minding her own business. To most observers, she appeared to be exactly the same person she had always been, but those who looked closely could see subtle changes. Her posture was slightly more erect, her movements more confident. Her dark eyes, always observant, now carried a quality that made troublemakers think twice before causing problems in her store. Word had spread through the criminal networks of the Southwest about the quiet widow in Copper Ridge, and her town had become notably safer as a result. Sheriff Bradley had filed his report with careful attention to detail, documenting the attempted robbery and the suspect's injuries without dwelling too heavily on how those injuries had been inflicted. Jake Morrison, Tommy Garrett, and Danny Morrison had all been charged with attempted robbery, breaking and entering, and weapons violations. Their court-appointed attorney had advised them to plead guilty and hope for lenient sentences. During their brief court appearance, all three men had seemed subdued and frightened. They spoke in whispers to their lawyer and avoided looking toward the gallery where Margaret sat quietly in a simple blue dress. When the judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, Jake Morrison had stood up shakily and said, "We're sorry, Your Honor. We won't ever do anything like this again." The judge, surprised by such a complete capitulation from men who had lengthy criminal records, had sentenced them to 2 years each in state prison. They had been model prisoners during their incarceration, causing no trouble and participating in every available rehabilitation program. Upon their release, all three had moved to different states and found legitimate employment. None of them had been arrested for any crime. Since that night in Copper Ridge, Margaret's general store had experienced a brief surge in business as curious visitors came to see the place where the famous confrontation had occurred. She had handled the attention with her usual quiet efficiency, neither encouraging nor discouraging the curiosity seekers. Eventually, the novelty had worn off, and business had returned to normal levels. The store itself remained largely unchanged, though Margaret had made a few subtle modifications. She had installed better lighting around the building's perimeter and had upgraded the locks on all doors and windows. She had also rearranged the interior layout slightly, ensuring that she always had clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. These changes were so minor that most customers never noticed them. Margaret's house had also received some quiet improvements. New locks, better lighting, and a few strategic modifications to the landscaping that provided better visibility while maintaining privacy. She had also installed a security system, though she had never needed to use it. The desert grapevine had been very effective at spreading the word that Margaret Santos was not someone to be trifled with. On quiet evenings, Margaret still practiced the routines Carlos had taught her. She threw knives at targets in her backyard, went through the fluid movements of Apache combat forms, and maintained the mental disciplines that had served her so well that October night. The practice sessions were no longer just about maintaining skills. They had become a way of honoring her husband's memory and staying connected to the warrior culture he had shared with her. The town of Copper Ridge had embraced its unlikely hero in its own understated way. The diner had added a Santos special to its menu, a hearty breakfast plate that reflected Margaret's no-nonsense approach to life. The local newspaper had run a brief article about the importance of community self-defense, though it had not mentioned Margaret by name. Even the preacher at the Methodist church had delivered a sermon about how quiet strength could be more powerful than loud bluster. Margaret's relationship with her neighbors had evolved as well. While she remained private and reserved, people now approached her with a mixture of respect and curiosity that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Chen had started bringing her homemade cookies on Sundays. The Rodriguez children waved enthusiastically whenever they saw her, and several of the local women had quietly asked if she might be willing to teach them some basic self-defense techniques. Margaret had politely declined those requests, explaining that the skills she possessed had been taught in a very specific cultural context that couldn't easily be transferred to others. What she didn't say was that the Apache fighting arts were sacred to her, a gift from her husband that she wasn't prepared to share with casual acquaintances. But she had made one exception. Sarah Martinez, a young widow with 2 small children, had approached Margaret after her own ex-husband had begun making threats. Margaret had spent several evenings teaching Sarah some basic awareness techniques and a few simple defensive moves. Nothing as elaborate as the skills Carlos had taught her, but enough to help Sarah feel more confident and prepared. The legend of the confrontation had taken on a life of its own throughout the desert Southwest. Truckers told the story at truck stops. Ranchers shared it over beers at local saloons. Even some law enforcement officers had begun referring to the Copper Ridge incident as an example of why criminals shouldn't assume that quiet people were easy targets. Margaret was aware of her growing reputation, but remained largely indifferent to it. She had never sought fame or recognition, and she didn't particularly want it now. Her goal had simply been to defend herself and her property against 3 men who had chosen to threaten her. The fact that the story had become legendary was interesting but irrelevant to her daily life. What mattered to her was that Copper Ridge remained a safe place to live and work. Crime rates in the area had dropped noticeably after word of the incident had spread. Other small desert towns had reported similar decreases in criminal activity, as if troublemakers had decided to look for easier targets elsewhere. Margaret Santos continued to open her store at 8 o'clock every morning, sweep the front porch, and arrange her outdoor displays. She helped customers with their purchases, maintained her inventory, and closed promptly at 5 o'clock each evening. She walked home along Pine Street at the same measured pace, ate dinner alone, and spent her evenings reading or working in her garden. To anyone who didn't know the story, she appeared to be exactly what she had always been, a quiet widow who minded her own business and caused no trouble for anyone. But those who looked closely could see the subtle signs of the warrior beneath the peaceful exterior. Her eyes missed nothing. Her movements were precise and controlled, and there was something in her bearing that suggested it would be very unwise to threaten her or anyone she cared about. As the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret Santos locked up her store and began her walk home. The evening was peaceful, the air was cool, and tomorrow would bring another day of quiet routine in the small town of Copper Ridge. It was exactly the life she wanted, and she was prepared to defend it against anyone foolish enough to threaten it. The legend of the quiet widow and the 3 ruffians would continue to grow and spread, but Margaret herself remained focused on simpler things, running her store, maintaining her home, and honoring the memory of the husband who had taught her that true strength often wore the mask of gentleness, until gentleness was no longer enough.